My name is Mark Belloni. I'm a historian and principal researcher with Belloni Research Consulting. And what I focus on is for clients, I specialize in researching historic homes and properties. I compile historic property reports. I also specialize in nominating properties to the National Register of Historic Places. So that is the federal government's official list of properties they deem worthy of preservation. It's a pretty technical process to have a house nominated, so I assist clients in that process. And then on the side, I also do a little bit of genealogy too, because my passion for history, I believe probably like many of you on this call tonight, my passion for history kind of stemmed initially from my journey with my own personal genealogy. So to get us started tonight, I want to talk about what are some reasons that you may want to research a historic property or a historic house. The first reason is you may have a personal connection to the place. So maybe you grew up in a historic home, or you currently own a historic home, or a family member owns a historic home. Simply having a connection to a place is a really good reason to dive into its story, to kind of better understand that place in your life and that place that your life unfolds. Another important reason that you may be researching a historic home is genealogy or local history. So I'm sure we have plenty of genealogists on this call tonight. Of course, all the families that you're researching, all of them call some place home. So you may want to be researching a historic home because it gives you insights into a certain family that you are researching. Like I mentioned regarding my work with the National Register of Historic Places, you may want to be researching a historic home for eligibility reasons for historic designation, or perhaps there's some preservation planning that is happening around a historic site. A lot of the times these designations and preservation efforts require a strong foundation in historical context. So historic research on a property helps with that, certainly. And then last but not least is one that I think a lot of people will understand. It's what I simply call the thrill of the hunt. So just the fun and the joy that you can get out of diving into the historical record and uncovering hidden histories that until now have been hidden. So the presentation tonight, what we're going to do is I'm going to go over at a very high level some core sources that I consider and what I use in my own work to be key sources when it comes to researching historic properties. And so I'm going to be walking through multiple source types tonight. And each source type, you're going to see these three icons. So I'm going to talk about what the source can tell you about a historic house, or what I use the source specifically to tell me about any one specific property I'm researching. I'm going to tell you where you can generally find them, recognizing that I have designed this presentation to hopefully be useful in a broad sense to research happening anywhere in the country. A lot of my work, though, most of my work is Indiana focused in the Midwest, focused on the Midwest. So when we're talking about where to find sources, you'll see that I do call out a lot of Indiana specific repositories, but I've hopefully designed this presentation in a way that even if you're not researching in Indiana or the Midwest, you can take away some helpful tidbits as well. And then in addition to that, I also try to call out a few pro tips or highlights or notes about certain sources. So if I have, just some tips or hints about using the specific source type that I'm talking about, I'll make sure to mention that as well. So you'll see this is the standard format as we cover each source type. And after I talk about each three of these areas, I'll just walk briefly through an example of that source. And before we dive into our first source, I just want to kind of highlight here that it's very critical in order to produce comprehensive and accurate property histories, you want to use multiple source types and then make sure that you're corroborating the source types with each other. It's very similar to the work that happens in genealogy, just we want really sound research when we're looking into historic properties. So one more slide before we dive into the source types. I always like to talk about build dates real quickly, because build dates, especially for historic homes, are usually the first thing that someone comes to me with, and they want to know when their house was built. So I want to talk real quick a note on build dates. So today, when we think of build dates for houses, we're all pretty familiar with the year built date field. That's kind of a part of a house's assessment record. So like when you're shopping for houses, oftentimes there'll be a year built listed with the house, and that comes from the property assessment. But it's really important to remember that these years were only really started to be collected on property assessments starting around 1940, but it still wasn't even that standard. It really didn't become a standard to kind of list and record a build date of a house until like the second half of the 20th century, so the 1960s and 70s. So all of this being said, if you're researching a house that was built before 1940 and there is a build date with the assessment, just make sure you approach that build date with an extreme amount of caution, because those build dates are likely estimates or sometimes just straight up guesses. Sometimes I've seen build dates wildly off by 50 or 60 years. So just keep that in mind when you're researching homes and you're looking at the actual year built of an assessment record. Determining a build date does require skilled research into multiple sources. It's generally not ever one source that tells you when a historic home was built. Sometimes you can get lucky, and perhaps there's a cornerstone on the house, or I'm sure some of you have seen like some old farmhouses in the countryside that have the year built kind of shingled into their roof. So sometimes you do get lucky, but more often than not, the build date does require research into multiple sources to kind of pin down. So let's get started then with our first source type. So the first source type I want to talk about are deeds and land transfer records, land transfer books. They're kind of called different things wherever you are in the country, but deeds and land transfer records, what can they tell you? Well, the most important thing they can do is they help you trace the chain of ownership of a specific property. So they let you build out, the ownership record from when the house was very first built into present day. And they can also tell you the exact dates of when the property transferred hands and then the amount paid for the property. Deeds are generally found at the local level at the county recorder's office. Land transfer ledgers or books or records, those are records that were produced to track land sales for tax assessment purposes. So more often than not, you would find those at the local level at the county auditor's office. So deed books, more often than not, county recorder. Land transfer books, more often than not, county auditors. Deed records specifically are increasingly being digitized, so you may have some luck on online repositories such as Ancestry or Family Search. When it comes to Indiana specifically, I know that Family Search does have a good collection of various Indiana counties, their deed records for various years. So there is some level of digitization happening around these records. Some important things to note about these is it's a popular misconception that build dates are included in deeds. When we're talking especially about Indiana and the Midwest, oftentimes deed records don't even mention built property or built, improvements on a property. They're strictly just talking about the land that the house sits on. As you move outside of the Midwest, you may find some deed records that do mention actual structures, but it's not often that actual build dates are included in deed records. So more often than not, don't expect to find a date in those records. And another helpful tip to keep in mind is land transfer books can often serve as indexes to deed books, and I'll kind of walk you through how that can happen in our next few slides. So on this slide here, we have an example of a land transfer book or a land transfer ledger that a county auditor's office may hold. So here you can see that there's a few pieces of information on this record. We have the date of transfer, we have the date of deed, we have to whom the property was transferred, and we have from whom the property was transferred, in addition to the legal description of the property. So this specific example that we're looking at here is actually multiple entries for the same piece of land that is actually being transferred from one estate with multiple children to one individual. So everyone you see under the from whom transferred owns a piece of the same land, and they are transferring them all to this individual, William Irwin here. So using this land ledger here, for instance, if we said, okay, I want to now locate the deed for the portion of the land that Thomas Jones transferred to William T. Irwin, we have the date of the deed here, January 12th, 1877. So now that land transfer books are often organized by county, township, and then alphabetically. While deed records are usually organized chronologically, so it's not very intuitive if you have a name to go into the deed books immediately first. It's more intuitive to go first to the land transfer books since they're alphabetized, find the entry, get the deed date, and then go to the deed books. So now that we've got this deed date for this line right here for Thomas Jones to William Irwin of January 12th, 1877, We could then pop over to the deed books at the county recorder's office, or if they're available online, and you can see here that this is the entry for that specific deed. So Thomas Jones and his wife to William Irwin. And this deed is going to tell you a lot of the same information that the land transfer book tells you, but this is kind of just, this is the more kind of original tied to the ownership record than the land transfer book. And these can sometimes tell you a little bit more information. It can often give you names of spouses and whatnot. So there is some genealogical value to deed records as well. And they can also give you information about the amount that the property was purchased for. So that is an example of land records and deeds. Next, I want to talk about tax records. Now, tax records may not be the first record that many people think about when researching historic homes specifically, but they are actually some of the sources that I go to first when researching a historic home, if I can get my hands on them, because what they tell you is actually can be quite valuable sometimes, because they can actually be the source that helps you determine the build date of a property. And in addition to helping you determine a build date of a property, they can also help support the chain of ownership that you might have constructed using deed and land transfer records as well. So where can you find tax records? Tax records are found at the local level as well, generally speaking, either at the county treasurer's office or the county auditor's office. And keep in mind that county level offices can sometimes have slight differences in names depending on where you are in the country. But generally speaking, county treasurer, county auditor's office. Also, you would want to check local historical societies. Sometimes if the treasurer auditor's office have really old tax records that they just can't keep in storage, they don't have enough space, they don't have the proper space to keep them preserved, they can sometimes pass those on to local historical societies. But keep in mind that these records, historic tax records, in my experience, in my research, are rarely digitized. And even when they're not digitized, it can be difficult to access physical copies. If physical copies are often kept off-site and in places that are not accessible to the public, so it can be hard to get your eyes on them. More often than not, you may find yourself working with an intermediary in the office to look at the records for you. And another thing to keep in mind when you're using historic tax records is that tax values like today do not equal market value. So just keep that in mind if you're looking at a historic tax record. If you see a tax value and then it's different than the value that you see perhaps in a deed record, just keep in mind that they're different values for different purposes. So this is an example of one tax record. This is what is known as a tax duplicate record. And these are very common in Indiana and other Midwest states, but other states have records that are similar to this. And essentially what a tax duplicate record is at the end of every tax year, county treasurer and county auditor's offices were required to reconcile their tax records to make sure there weren't any discrepancies. And the product of that reconciliation was produce what was known as a tax duplicate record. And tax duplicates give you very basic information about parcels of land. They give you information they essentially give you the names of the owners, the description of the land, and then they give you two values. And this is kind of where their value comes into place. They give you the value of the land by itself, but more importantly, they also give you this, more often than not, they give you the value of the improvements on the land. So the value of improvements on the land is speaking to, man-made structures on the land. So whether that be agricultural buildings or dwellings or fencing, the value of improvements refers to man-made structures on a site. So the way that you can use tax records, and the way that I've used them with quite a bit of success to figure out build dates for properties, is if you collect tax records for a series of years and you take the value of improvements and look at how that evolved over the year, you can usually pinpoint a big jump in the value. And generally speaking, you can then take that year that you see that jump and take it to other records and see if you can kind of support the fact that a house was built, and that jump in improvements indicates that a house was built. And in my experience, there's been a lot of houses that I use this method to date their initial, like my first take at their construction date, and I take that year that I find the jump in, and I go look in other records, and I can confirm that indeed that is the year that the house was built. So tax records, not often thought about as being used for historic home research, but can offer some, they're incredibly boring, but they can offer some fascinating clues into construction dates for sure. And they are also organized county, township, and then alphabetically. So if you have the name of owner, if the names of the owners, they are relatively easy to search as well. So moving on now to a more visual source, let's talk a little bit about historical maps. So historical maps are really good. They can tell you information about the overall context of the area or the neighborhood that the house finds itself in. They can also tell you about larger development patterns of the surrounding area. And they too can also help determine build dates, depending on what type of map that you're using. And I'll jump over to the notes section real quick. When it comes to historical maps, I think of them as, there's two main types in my head. And in the research that I do, there's two main types. There are county atlases that I often use when researching houses that are more rural in nature. And then there are insurance maps that I use when researching homes that are in cities or larger towns. The two examples that I'll show you here in a second are examples of one of each of those types of maps. So where to find them? Specifically here in Indiana, I found a lot of luck using the Library of Congress website. Library of Congress has a really fantastic digitized map collection for maps across the entire country. And then specific also to the state of Indiana, if you're researching a home inside of this state, IU Libraries has a fantastic collection of digitized maps. But of course, run-of-the-mill historical societies, your local library, your local genealogy center, are all good places too to try and locate historic maps. So this is an example of a county atlas. County atlases were super popular in the United States, kind of in the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And they give you information that you can definitely find in other sources, such as deed and tax records, but they present it to you in a different way that can kind of reveal different, when you're presented with the same data in a different way, it can reveal things that you didn't see before looking at it in another source. So county atlases often give you all of the parcels in any specific county. It gives you the acreage, it gives you the names of the owners of those parcels, and sometimes it can also signify where residences were on those specific plats. They also point out things, major structures in the community, such as churches or schools. They lay out roads oftentimes, and they also can indicate, creeks and streams and other geographical features on the land. The level of detail that county atlases have from county to county in this country it's pretty vast. Some counties have very detailed county atlases. Some are kind of more on the basic side. But I like to use these when I'm researching rural homes to get just a better idea of the overall neighborhood that the house existed in its past. So now let's move to insurance maps, and specifically I'm sure many people on this call have heard of a Sanborn fire insurance maps. Essentially what fire insurance maps were, they were the product of insurance companies essentially wanting to assess fire risk in certain areas. So thanks to the insurance industry, historians, genealogists, house researchers have actually been blessed with a very valuable collection of very detailed maps for cities and large towns across this country. This here is an example of a Sanborn fire insurance map. And looking at this, you can just see the level of detail that it gives. Each Sanborn insurance map, which keep in mind generally were released for multiple years, often in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, you can find a good year span for these maps. And each map contains really good keys and legends that kind of lay out how to read them. But just looking at this example here, for example, just the color of the structure themselves indicates what the structure is made out of. So yellow is for frame buildings, pink is for brick buildings. A solid line versus a dashed line indicates like structural walls of a house versus what would be a porch or a veranda. Another thing to keep in mind is the footprints that are recorded in these maps are actually also very, very accurate for when the maps were made. So the footprints that you get from these maps are also very accurate. They also do a really good job of laying out outbuildings that may have been related to the house and actually labeling what these outbuildings were. These are just kind of some of the most invaluable sources that house historians have at their disposal. But keep in mind that these maps are really only available for cities and larger towns. If you're researching a historic farmhouse that is out in the county, you're unfortunately not going to have these, because the purpose of these were insurance, large urban areas with lots of houses in one area. So you won't find these researching rural houses, only urban. So next source type, let's talk about census records and city directories. So census records, you know, one of kind of like the core sources of genealogical work. So I think most of us probably know the value of a census record. But what can census records and city directories tell us specifically in the context of historic house research? So they can tell you obviously about the house's composition, so who lived in the house, what they did. They can also tell you about historic addresses. So a lot of the times, both street names and the actual address number changes multiple times through history. So census records and city directories can be helpful in tracing those changes as well. And they can also obviously give you information on neighbors. You know, you may be researching one specific house, but it's always interesting to kind of widen your view a little bit more and look into like who was living around that house and kind of the histories of the surrounding houses as well. Census records, of course, are extremely accessible online. Family Search, Ancestry.com. You've got those at your fingertips. City directories often are also pretty commonly digitized as well, either through like local historical societies or state libraries, even local libraries. But even if they aren't digitized, definitely libraries and historical societies will have them in their collections as well. The number one thing that I want to highlight about census records and city directories is that, realize that you can use city directories to fill in residence information between census years. Because as we all know, the census records exist for every decade, right? So we've got 1870, 1880, unfortunately not the 1890 anymore, 1900, 1910, 1920, what have you, right? But for the years between those, there's no census records. So city directories, on the other hand, were often published much more frequently, especially for larger cities. So oftentimes you can find city directories that are subsequently published year after year. So you can use those years to fill in the gaps for residency information for a property in between the census records. So I'm actually not going to bring up an example of a census record, just because I feel like it's one of the most commonly used sources just in general when it comes to the genealogy and historic research. But I am going to just wanted to quickly show you what some entries look like in a city directory. So these are entries pulled from the Indianapolis City Directory for a few years spanning the turn of the century. So 1898 to 1907, this is pulling the address 212 Barth Avenue, which is just south of the city near Garfield Park, if anybody is familiar. But essentially, this is just a really quick example of how you can use these census records to fill in the gaps between the decades, but also track kind of change of ownerships too. So another way to kind of support chain of ownership. So obviously here we see from 1898 to 1905, we see Mary Hildemeyer living at 2124 Barth, but then come 1907, we now have a change of ownership. And instead of just Mary living in the house, we have both a John Dampier and a Henry living at the property as well. So just a really quick example as to how these can be leveraged. Also remember what I said about using these to track historic addresses in the way that they change too. You can follow a family at one address, and in using city directories in tandem with like insurance maps, you can do wonders in tracking. Sometimes the change in addresses can get really kind of discombobulating, but using those two sources can help you really kind of keep track of what's going on. So I want to talk about now one of my favorite sources to use just in historical research in general, not just for historic home research, but just in general. I absolutely love newspapers. So in the context of historic houses, what can newspapers tell you? Well, they can tell you a lot about, especially if we're talking about urban areas, they can tell, even rural too, but they can tell you about construction dates. They can tell you about alterations that have happened to a house, whether that be purposeful through like renovations or additions or remodelings, or alterations that came about because of disasters such as fire or flooding or whatnot. And they can also tell you, just about the everyday events that happen inside of homes. So often when we're doing research on historic homes, we just have little teeny bits of information from really very scattered sources, some deed records, some maps, some tax records. But historic newspapers really kind of tell you about the lives that were lived in a home and like really give you an intimate history of what unfolded there. So that's kind of where their value lies specifically. Where to find historic newspapers? Obviously, newspaperarchive.com and newspapers.com have fantastic collections. You can get your own subscription to these, but oftentimes you can also access these collections through your local library. There's often partnerships there. In the state of Indiana specifically, we have Hoosier State Chronicles, which is just the state's specific repository for digitized newspapers. A lot of states also have their own version of Hoosier State Chronicles. So depending on where you are, check to see if your state has a state-specific repository that specifically just concerns itself with that state's historic newspaper. And the most important thing to remember when using historic newspapers is be really strategic and creative with your keyword searches, because you'll be really surprised how much you can squeeze out of a collection of historic newspapers just by changing up how you search for things. So changing the noun, like, it's the most simple example of this is instead of just using the word house, you're going to want to think about things such as residence or dwelling or things along those lines. But even when it comes to addresses or the owner's names or the area that the house is found in, really try and squeeze your brain as to how you can come up with different keyword search combinations. And actually, I know AI is like the thing now. And one of the most useful things that I've found that AI can help me with in my historic research is coming up with creative ways to do keyword searches in historic newspapers. So if you just ask any AI model to help you out with that, it will spit out, unbelievable number of combinations that will, I guarantee you'll be shocked about how much you can squeeze out of a historic newspaper by switching up your keyword searches. So these are some examples, just some random examples from previous research that I've done for clients on homes, just to give you kind of a peek into some things, some examples of what newspapers can tell you about a historic home. So up here on the left, we have a newspaper item concerning a Dr. Bridges, and this is talking about the work he's doing in converting a certain residence into a rental dwelling, but also the building of his own residence. So some fascinating insights there. On the bottom left, we have an actual kind of just like a straight up documentation of a house being built. So obviously, if you have newspaper items like that, you just take the year that the newspaper was published and you've got a pretty good gauge on when that home was completed. If oftentimes when houses were completed, that was a significant thing in a local community. So they would be noted in local newspapers. On the top right, we have a snippet of building permits. So especially in larger cities, whenever a building permit would have been filed with a city, oftentimes those were just published as public notices in the city's newspaper. And they would publish the name of the owner, the address that the construction was happening at, oftentimes what kind of work was being done. So if it was like straight up new construction, or if it was an addition to a property, and it will also often give you how much the project was going to cost. So this is also a really good way to get build dates and kind of support a build date with stringing together other sources. You can get really lucky with building permits when talking about large cities. And then the bottom right is an example of just kind of like that event category I was talking about, and also alteration. So here we have an example of a fire that took place in a home. So obviously, whenever a big disaster would have happened, it was written about. But it's not just disasters. I mean, you can get great things about family reunions that happen. It was not uncommon for people to get married inside of houses, for funerals to happen inside of houses. So all of those things, the really intimate details about day-to-day life, can be found in newspapers. And my favorite part of this newspaper snippet is the very last line. A mouse and a match in the Davenport are to be blamed in the official report. So a little bit of humor there in the local paper. Okay, now getting on to photographs. So everybody, if they were researching a historic home, wishes they could find a historic photograph of the home. It's kind of the holy grail of historic home research. And why? Basically because it tells you, they're just cool. It's just cool to see an old photo of a home. But really the value of them is it tells you about the original appearance and materials of the home. So especially if you're talking about preservation work, historic photographs are super valuable in that regards. So where to find historic photographs, specifically in Indiana, if we have Indiana residents on this call. If you are not familiar with the Indiana album, immediately after this presentation, go to Google and type in the Indiana album and acquaint yourself with that. It is a fantastic, fantastic collection that is growing day by day of just just a collection of historic photographs from across the state. The way it operates is people donate their photographs. The Indiana album scans them, gets them cataloged online in searchable form. So there is just countless number of historic photographs across all Indiana counties, lots of historic homes on that website, some identified, some not, but photographs nonetheless. Of course, we have Indiana Memory, and then just in general, for wherever you are, libraries, local historical societies always have some sort of historic photo collection. Whether or not it's digitized depends on the institution that we're talking about, but oftentimes you can search those physical collections as well. And then last but not least, I've had luck in the past, tracking descendants of the original owners of a home or the builders of a home. So you have to do some genealogical work, but if you can trace the descendants of the original family and find descendants who are still living today and reach out to them, often, I don't know if I'll say oftentimes, there is a chance that in their old family photo collections, they may have a photograph of that specific house. I have had a little bit of luck with this in the past. It's kind of a last ditch effort, but it definitely is an option. And what I want to kind of a pro tip I want to offer when it comes to using historic photographs, everybody would like to find a photograph of the house just straight up, a beautiful picture of the facade of the house, but realize that you can also find out information. Look for photographs that may be around the house and see if you can find the house in the background. Just because you can't find a picture of the home straight on doesn't mean you should quit searching for it, because it may exist in other areas. And the best example I have of this is this photograph right here. So this photograph is a photograph of the beautiful sheriff's residence in Danville, Indiana, which is located the county seat of Hendricks County. And this is the sheriff's residence, and the jail is in the back of it. This home was built in 1866. It's still standing today. It's the home of the Hendricks County Historical Society. However, the value of this photograph is not because of this beautiful home that we see here in the forefront. The value of this photograph actually, believe it or not, comes in the bottom left-hand side. If you look at the bottom left of this photograph, you'll see behind the tree, it runs behind the tree, you'll see a little roof line with a chimney sticking out of it. And what that is actually is a home that I was researching. At one point in the early 20th century, that home was actually picked up off its foundation and rotated to face a different direction. So originally the home faced east, and it was picked up and rotated to face south. And I was looking for some additional, like we had maps, we had some newspaper articles that recounted this, but I wanted some visual evidence of the house in its original orientation, and could not find a picture of the actual house, like, from the street or from anywhere close to the front facing angle. So then I thought to myself, okay, what exists around the house that would have been photographed a lot back in the day? And then I said, okay, well, just to the east, we have this beautiful Second Empire home that I'm sure was photographed multiple times. So lo and behold, I dive into the photographs for this building, and in the back, there we have the home, the roof line of the home facing in its original orientation. So, not super valuable in the sense of like it shows like what the house originally looked like, but it's a critical piece of evidence when piecing together the history of the home and the way that it was moved on the street. So an example of how you're going to want to pay attention to the background of photos too when using them for historic home research. I wanted to talk real quickly about aerials too, because historic aerials are something that I sometimes use in my research, and they can be quite valuable. So historic aerials were kind of like before satellite imagery became a thing. They became really popular like in the first half of the 20th century and through the second half of the 20th century. They were used for purposes like urban planning, agricultural reasons, infrastructure planning. A lot of the times you can locate historic aerials that when you zoom in, you can make out historic properties. And just a real quick example of how I've used these in the past. This is a sequence of 3 photos of the same property. And in the 1948 picture in the photo, and I know this for previous research that I've done on this property, this right here, this roof line you're looking at, is actually an Italianate farmhouse that was built in 1874 in Hendricks County. It no longer is standing, and I was trying to figure out when that house was demolished and when it disappeared from the landscape. And by stringing together these historic aerials, I was able to kind of get an idea of when that might have happened. So obviously here in 1948, We still have the farmstead, the farm, the outbuildings, driveways. Come to 1958, outbuildings are still there, the driveway is still there. The house might still be there. At this point, this photograph was taken in the summer, so the trees have grown in. But given that the property looks like, the outbuildings, the drive's still there, this looks like a property to me that there probably is a house still standing there. So I conclude that in 1958, that house was probably among those trees. However, then when you move to 1970 and actually other aerials that I don't have included here, you see that the house completely has disappeared from the landscape. So this has been the only evidence that I've been able to find that documents this house, being demolished. I can't find that in any other historical record. So this is an example of how aerials can be very valuable when researching historic houses. The last source type that I want to cover, this is the last one, and it's houses themselves. Because when we're researching historic homes, they themselves are absolutely 100% a primary source that you should use to write a house's history. They can tell you all kinds of stuff, and most importantly, they can tell you about the approximate build dates, which I'll get into in the next slide. They can tell you information about previous owners, and they of course can tell their own story about the evolution that they underwent through time. So there were additions added, if things were taken off, window or door alterations, they can tell their story of kind of like the physical alterations. Where to find them, obviously that is self-explanatory. And then, like I mentioned here, remember, so when we talk about American architectural styles and American house forms, these more often than not can very easily be tied to periods in American history. The house themselves can help you date them, and it's a pretty fail-safe method. This is an example here on the screen of a few very distinct American architectural styles that are found across the country, but most commonly in Indiana. And each one of these styles can be tied to a specific year range. So we've got Greek Revival, we have Italianate, Queen Anne, Craftsman. This is by no means all of the American architectural styles, but this is some of the most popular ones. And each one of these styles saw its heyday. So Greek Revival, 1825 to 1860, Italianate, roughly 1840 to 85, Queen Anne, 1880, 1910, Craftsman, 1905, 1930. So what this lets you do is for example, if you are researching a Queen Anne home, not to go to sources that are from the 1840s and 1850s to look for a build date, for example, because Queen Anne homes they were not being built in the 1840s and 1850s here. They just weren't. Same can be said with the Italianates. Like if you are researching an Italianate home, you're not going to go to records that are from the 1920s and 1930s because Italianate homes, their period was over. People, the fad was out. They were not being built anymore. So really rely on these as kind of like a starting point to get a general idea of when a house was when a house was built. And there's plenty of information online. If no one has heard of this book before, I would recommend everyone go out and get a copy of Virginia McAllister's A Field Guide to American Houses. It's kind of like the Bible for American architecture and American architectural history. And it has every house type. It helps you identify the house type and date it as well. So super valuable resource there. Two more examples before I wrap up of how houses themselves can be really valuable resources themselves. And these are kind of like really specific examples. I'm not going to say this is going to be possible for everyone, but they're really fun. So I figured I would include them here. So what you're looking at here is actually a maker's mark on a door of an 1880s farmhouse. And when the paint on the door was stripped off, this pencil mark was found on the door. And what it reads EHE and Co. And then it says INDPS. And taking those letters, that combination of letters, and going to historic newspapers, we can actually find that there was an E.H. Eldridge and Co. in Indianapolis that was essentially a manufacturer of a bunch of different house elements. So doors, windows, all kinds of things that it takes to build a house. So looking for things like this on the actual physical elements of a house can sometimes let you tie it to other sources to let you tell a bigger story about kind of how a house was built and where all of its pieces came from. And this is the last one I'll show because it's super special. It's actually from my own home that my wife and I have been restoring for the past 7 years. And this is another example of how a house can tell its own history. So this is a note that we actually found that was handwritten on a wall in our home when we were paint stripping it. We were paint stripping plaster walls in our house, believe it or not. And this note was put up in 1905 by the family that lived there then, before wallpaper was put on. So at some point in history, the wallpaper was taken off and then this note was painted over. But when we stripped the paint off of the plaster walls, we found this note. And it's just a really intimate kind of look into the people who lived in this house prior to us. Elsie Eaton was the one who wrote this note. She gives us a quick summary of her family, what her husband's doing, and my most favorite part of this note is the very end. She says, "It's been a late wet spring, not much corn planted yet," and she just signs her name. And it brings a really human element to the house that we love. We plan on framing this, but it's just a really special thing and a really good example of how houses can tell their own history. So that brings me to the end of kind of my broad overview of the sources that I think are most valuable when researching historic homes. I want to leave you all with this final note, though. Rumors, myths, and foggy memories oftentimes cloud the truth about historic homes. So always, always, always verify your claims with solid documented evidence. It's of utmost importance that the histories we write about the built environment around us are grounded in solid historical methodology. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. I thank you all very much for joining me this evening. And at this time, I'd be happy, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer or try to answer. I'll let you know if I don't have an answer for you. And then my information is here too as well. I invite you to visit my site or reach out via email.
We do have a couple questions for you. So the first one is, what did you use to find or obtain the aerial photographs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So aerial photographs, it varies state by state where you can find these. Generally speaking, the best luck that I would start off first by looking at a state's GIS system. So if you just Google your state and then well, I guess start with county. So Google the county that you're researching in and then Google GIS. And if they have an online GIS portal, Geographic Information Systems, it's a digital portal where all of their land records are held essentially, and sometimes they've got historical aerials kind of mapped onto that, and you can filter by layers and kind of overlay historic aerials. Other than that, in Indiana specifically, the state archives has a really good collection of historical aerials. So I'd recommend, if you're not in the state of Indiana, check with your state archives. I haven't personally run into a lot of local historical societies or libraries having historical aerials, but I could be mistaken there. I would obviously check there as well. But I would say state level archives and then county GIS systems would probably be your best bet there.
Thank you. And then another good question here is, how would you define a historical house? So do you see it as a
Yeah,
house with a certain age or?
yeah. That's a great question. I was just thinking about this because I was right. I'm getting ready to write a column in our local paper that is about two houses in our county. The oldest verified house in our county, and then what I consider to be kind of like the newest historical home. So I guess before I tell you about that, there's sometimes people, like, for instance, when we're talking about the National Register of Historic Places, there is a very clean cutoff for definition of historic there. That is 50 years. The house has to, more often than not, I'm sorry if you hear my dogs barking in the background, more often than not, a house for the National Register has to be 50 years old, at least 50 years old, to be eligible. However, in my opinion, it's really up to the researcher to determine what's historical. I've got going back to what I was talking about with the column that I'm writing. So we've got the oldest house in our county that is from 1831, I believe. And then we have another house that is actually just down the street from me that was built in 1967. And it's just a stellar example of a mid-century modern house. And it was actually designed and built by a very famous female architect from Indianapolis. Even though that was built in 1960, did I say seven? I think it was 69. I still 100% consider that a historic house just because of the story behind it. So it's, when you're dealing with official processes like the National Register, there are specific definitions. Other than that, it's really up to whoever's researching the house, in my opinion.
Helpful. Thank you. Um, Looks like we have one more question. So,
Mhm.
do you have any particular resources or tips for deciphering deeds when the language might be a little bit unfamiliar or some legal language is used?
Yeah, so I forgot to mention this. If you're going to dive into deed records, I would recommend giving yourself a crash course, and there are many, many resources online. Giving yourself, and it also depends on like what state you're looking at, with what deed records you're looking at in what state. But overall, if you can familiarize yourself and give yourself a crash course on like the land survey system that was used in the United States throughout history, and learn how to read legal descriptions, and the southwest quarter of the northeast quadrant of township 27 north, range 3 east. That all stems from the survey system of this country. So if just go online and find some resources to educate yourself on the survey system, and that should more often than not give you some help in reading deeds.
Thank you. So I think that'll finish us up for today. Just wanted to mention if anybody has any additional questions or if you'd like a copy of the chat, our email's in the chat, genealogy@acpl.info. So we'd be glad to get that to you. So thank you again, Mark, for your time and for your presentation tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone, appreciate it. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Take care.